When the racist HOA tried to bury Big Shaq's pride under bylaws and silence his legacy with policy, they didn't expect the quiet storm brewing behind that bronze smile. They saw lawn decor, Big Shaq saw legacy, and when they moved to erase it, he didn't protest. He purchased power, property by property, until the whole block belonged to him. Because some men don't fight back with noise, they rewrite the rules in ink. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. They called it Sycamore Street, but it wasn't the kind of place that changed much. Not its flower beds, not its coffee orders, and certainly not its people. White picket fences weren't just decorative here, they were symbolic. Everything was trimmed, manicured, curated to blend in. That's why when Shaquille O'Neal moved in, he didn't blend. He stood out, and not just because of his 7-foot frame or the championship rings that still made grocery clerks do double takes. It was his presence that unsettled some of them, steady, grounded, and impossible to ignore. They didn't call him Big Shaq here, not Superman. On Sycamore, he was Mr. Shaq, the man who waved first, remembered birthdays, and once shoveled the Hendersons' driveway, after a surprise frost, just because he was up early and had time to move some snow. The kids adored him. He built them a little lending library on his front lawn, stocked with comic books and sports bios, then added solar lights so they could borrow even after dinner. To them, he wasn't a celebrity. He was the tallest, kindest neighbor with the coolest stories and the warmest smile. But his lawn, now that was something people talked about. A wide, sweeping green, with a soft slope that caught the sun just right around 4 p.m. It was a canvas. At the far edge stood a bronze statue, the silhouette of a man with a wide chest and broader smile, mid-laugh, frozen in joy. His late father, beside it, spaced with care, fluttered flags from over 20 countries, from Ghana to Guatemala, Jamaica to Japan. Each one had a story. Each one represented someone Shaq had loved, worked with, or learned from. And in the evening when the sun dipped low, the solar-lit angels glowed softly, quiet, watchful, grounding. To Shaq, it wasn't decor, it was legacy. But Sycamore didn't know how to handle legacy, especially when it wasn't whitewashed, curated, or muted. The kids saw magic. The adults, some just saw difference. And difference in their minds brought discomfort. The murmurs didn't start all at once. They came slow, like fog under a doorframe. Quiet remarks about property uniformity, offhand jokes about Vegas lawns, and comparisons to neighborhoods that had gone downhill. But Shaq didn't flinch. He greeted everyone the same, with a wave, a nod, and a calm that came from years of learning when to speak and when to let silence do the talking. Still, some neighbors, mostly the ones who never made eye contact, began walking their dogs on alternate routes. The HOA president, a tightly wound man named Thaddeus Holt, started sending out monthly newsletters that included passive-aggressive reminders about community standards and visual harmony. No names, of course, just enough sting to know who they were aimed at. But Shaq didn't respond, not yet. He dealt with louder critics, on bigger stages, with brighter lights. This was a whisper war, and he was a man who listened. At night he'd sit on his porch with a blanket draped over his shoulders, sipping chamomile tea from a mug the size of a planter. Sometimes, he'd stare at the statue of his father, and think about what the old man would have said. Probably something like, "You know what makes him nervous?
Not the gold. It's the fact you don't hide it."
Then he'd chuckle. "Smile, son. Let him choke on it." What people didn't know was that Shaq had chosen this neighborhood for a reason. Not for prestige, not for silence. He'd grown up around struggle, and success had shown him how some communities guard their comfort like treasure. He wanted a place where his kind of joy, loud, open, unapologetic, could exist without being labeled extra. But what he found was something else. Attention. Not aggressive, not hostile, just coated, like syrup on glass. Sweet enough to deny, thick enough to see. He noticed the way people paused when walking past his house, how the HOA newsletter always featured homes that looked identical, how no one ever asked about the flags or the sculpture, even though they were impossible to miss. One woman once said at the mailboxes, "You know, I think your lawn makes people feel overwhelmed." She smiled like it was a compliment. It wasn't. Shaq just nodded, let her walk away, then whispered, "Good." Because he wasn't there to make people comfortable. He was there to remind them that belonging isn't a negotiation. One day, a boy named Charlie, no older than 8, stopped in front of the statue. Shaq was trimming the bushes nearby. "Is that your dad?" the boy asked, pointing at the figure. "Yeah," Shaq said, pausing. "That's him laughing at one of his own bad jokes." Charlie grinned. "He looks happy." Shaq smiled. He was, especially when people tried to tell him who he couldn't be. The boy nodded, then ran off toward his own house, his shoelaces flapping. Moments like that, those were the reason Shaq never changed a thing. Still, he felt something shifting. Not the kind you see, but the kind you sense, like a storm that hasn't darkened the sky yet, but you can already feel in your knees. He remembered an interview once, years ago, when a reporter asked him why he always helped people behind the scenes. "You don't gotta show up loud," Shaq had said. "You just gotta show up." And here on Sycamore Street, he'd shown up in the biggest way he knew how, with presence, with legacy, with light. What he didn't know yet was that light can attract the people who love it, and expose the ones who fear it. The day before it all began, he stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching the flags flutter in unison. The wind had picked up just enough to make the angels' glow flicker like candles. Shaq tilted his head, smiled gently, and whispered to no one in particular, "I wonder how long they think I'll stay quiet." Because some storms don't roar. They wait. And this storm was just getting warm. There was something resting neatly against the inside of his front door. No envelope, no postmark, just a single piece of paper, white, heavy stock, the kind used for resumes and obituaries. Typed in stiff, careful font were the words, "Your property's display does not align with the community's aesthetic values. Please review HOA guidelines. Section 42A, regarding outdoor embellishments. Non-compliance will result in further action." No name, no signature, no warmth, just intent. Shaq read it twice, then once more. Not for clarity, but for tone. He could feel the chill between the lines. Whoever had written it hadn't just followed a rulebook, they had weaponized it. He exhaled, long and low, then smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. He'd grown up around this kind of message, never spoken out loud, always dressed in professionalism, always careful not to say exactly what they meant. But it was there. In the word embellishments. In the phrasing "does not align." This wasn't about his lawn. It was about him. The flags. The angels. The statue of his father mid-laugh. They weren't too big. They were too black, too proud, too visible. Shaq folded the letter with the kind of care one reserves for a final piece of evidence. In a long trial, he walked to the hallway and opened the middle drawer of a narrow cabinet, where he kept receipts for repairs, vendor invoices, old birthday cards, and a folder labeled in black Sharpie, "Fuel." He slid the letter in. Then he made himself breakfast. Not because he didn't care, but because if he let every fire burn him, he'd never stop being scorched. Still, something had shifted. Later that afternoon, he sat on the porch, watching the wind roll through the trees like it had a secret. The neighborhood was too quiet. There were no kids on scooters, no dogs barking. Even the usual sound of a mower 2 houses down was absent. He noticed a curtain twitch across the street. The Fletchers. They usually waved. Today they didn't. He shifted in his chair and glanced back at the sculpture. His father's bronze silhouette caught the light just right. Face tilted upward, mouth open in laughter. He looked in that moment, defiant. Shaq remembered something his father used to say when they were driving through neighborhoods like this. "Ain't it funny how silence is only golden when you're the one writing the rules?" He stayed on that porch for over an hour, unmoving, letting the weight of the letter sink in. The threat wasn't direct, but that was what made it dangerous. They didn't want him to know who they were. They just wanted him to disappear quietly. He didn't. Instead, that evening, Shaq did something he hadn't done in a while. He walked the entire block, slow and steady, like he was learning the neighborhood all over again. He waved to every house. Some waved back, tight smiles, nervous glances. Others didn't open their blinds. And that's when he saw it. On Holt's porch, a folding table set up for lemonade, 2 metal chairs, and a copy of the HOA guidelines resting perfectly on the top rail, like a decoration. Holt was nowhere in sight. But that book? That was intentional. Shaq didn't take the bait. He just kept walking. At the end of the block, he saw something that made him stop cold. A young couple, maybe new, maybe just quiet, were standing at their mailbox, holding a flyer. Shaq recognized it instantly. The same kind of paper, the same layout, the same robotic font. They saw him see it. The woman looked embarrassed. The man folded it up quickly and said something about probably just junk. Shaq nodded, but he didn't forget. Back home, he grabbed his phone and called Maria, the local landscaper he worked with. "Maria," he said, "you still got those LED strips? For the lawn angels?" she asked. "No," Shaq said. "For the flags. Light 'em up like it's the 4th of July." That night, the corner of Sycamore Street glowed. The angels looked divine. The flags shimmered in slow motion under beams of soft, dancing light. It wasn't loud. It wasn't garish. It was truth in color. The next morning, there was another letter. Same font, same tone. This time slid under the garage door. "This is a second notice. Non-conforming features may result in financial penalties and potential removal." Shaq read it, then did something unexpected. He drove down to the local bakery and bought 12 cinnamon rolls, placed them in a box, and wrote a card that said, "From your neighbor who's too bright for your blinds." He walked house to house, left a roll at every door that had refused to wave, including the Fletchers. Not a word. Just the rolls. And the smile. Because that's how you throw a punch when they don't expect kindness. That evening, he sat on the porch again, watched as one by one, porch lights turned on across the block. He heard faint voices, a door slam, someone arguing in hushed tones 2 houses down. And then, around 9 p.m., his phone buzzed, an unknown number. When he answered, a voice, careful, slow, said,
"Mr. O'Neill, this is Brian. I'm on the HOA board. I just wanted to let you know that, some of us weren't involved in the letter."
Shaq leaned back. Which letter? Pause. Then, the one someone's been sending. "Thanks for the heads up," Shaq said. "But if no one signed it, everyone owns it."
Silence.
Shaq hung up. Now he knew something for sure. The HOA wasn't unified. There was dissent. Fear. Someone had overplayed their hand. He didn't need names. Not yet. Because war wasn't loud. War was quiet. A chessboard in the dark. And Big Shaq had just taken the first piece. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from pressure. That's what started creeping into Sycamore Street after the second letter. It wasn't anything you could point at directly, but you could feel it settle into the corners like dust behind a curtain. Shaq noticed the changes first in the smallest ways. The kids who used to shout his name from handlebars now just nodded. A woman who always waved while walking her golden retriever crossed to the opposite sidewalk. Someone he didn't know, someone who'd never said a word before, slowed their car in front of his house one evening, rolled down the window halfway, and then just drove off again without a word. Shaq didn't chase it. He just paid attention. The ball was what confirmed it. He'd been outside trimming the bushes when a red kickball bounced across the road from the Lewis's yard. He picked it up, gave it a little spin in his palm like a basketball out of habit, then tossed it back underhand over their white vinyl fence. No response. Not even a thanks from the kids who usually scrambled to catch it. No face appeared. No wave from the porch. Just stillness. That night, Shaq sat on his back steps, the porch lights off, letting the dark wrap around him. He didn't feel small. He never had. But he felt something narrowing, like space was being slowly taken away. Not by fences, but by permission. He remembered something Lucille had told him years ago, back when he was just a rookie. She'd said, "They'll never tell you you're not welcome. They'll just stop making you feel at home." And that was exactly what this felt like. So the next morning, Shaq did something different. He changed his route. Instead of heading to the gym, he walked east, past the row of homes that wrapped around the edge of the block. 2 streets over, the homes were older, more lived in, less manicured, the kind of places where the paint might peel a little, but the porches still held rocking chairs with history in them. That's where he met Joseph and Lila Monroe. It was the garden that caught his eye first. Not the flowers, though they were blooming wild and proud, but the small bronze bust nestled among them. A young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., eyes to the sky, mouth caught mid-sentence. Shaq stopped at the gate. "You can come in," Lila said from the porch, her voice kind but firm. "We don't believe in watching from behind the curtains." She was in her 70s, maybe more, with a head wrap the color of turmeric and eyes that had clearly seen too much but had lost none of their fire. Joseph sat beside her, a quiet mountain of a man, wearing suspenders, and tapping his foot softly like there was music only he could hear. Shaq introduced himself. He didn't have to. Lila waved it off like he'd said something silly. Boy, we've been watching you since you first moved in. Only reason we ain't said hello is we figured you'd been through enough waving already. They talked for an hour, about everything and nothing, and then almost casually, Shaq nodded toward the statue. It's beautiful, he said. Did the HOA give you any grief about it? Joseph snorted. Lila just smiled a sad, knowing smile. They didn't give us grief, she said. They gave us removal orders. She told him the story, how 20 years back, when they'd first moved in, Lila had installed the statue in memory of her brother, who'd marched in Selma. The next morning, the bust was gone. No explanation, no formal notice, just silence. Days later, they received a vague letter, citing unapproved ornamental installations. No one would admit who authorized the removal. No one apologized. And when they tried to challenge it, the board simply quoted bylaws and told them if they continued to press, they'd be fined. We got the message, Joseph said quietly. It wasn't about the rules. It was about the reminder. What reminder? Shaq asked. That we were never meant to be here. Not proudly, at least. That sentence stuck to Shaq's ribs. He left with more than a heavy heart. He left with clarity. This wasn't about his lawn. This wasn't about solar-lit angels, or flags, or a sculpture of a man who smiled too loudly in bronze. This was about patterns. It was about control, about whose stories were allowed to be told in public, and whose had to stay behind closed doors. Shaq walked home slowly, the Monroe's voices replaying in his head. On the corner near Holt's house, he saw two of the board members chatting quietly. They didn't wave, just watched. He could see it now. The web. It wasn't a neighborhood. It was a stage, and anyone who didn't follow the script got written out of the play. When he got home, Shaq opened the drawer again, the one labeled fuel. He added a sticky note beside the first letter. Lawn isn't the first. That night, he stood in his yard long after the lights had gone out. He didn't need to check behind curtains anymore. He knew who was watching, and he wanted them to see him, see them. The wind picked up and tugged at the flags gently, like they were nodding in agreement. Shaq didn't feel anger. Not yet. He felt responsibility, because silence wasn't survival. It was surrender. And if this place was going to bury history again, they were going to have to bury it alive. 3 days after his talk with the Monroes, 3 days after the ball rolled back without a thank you, and the glances became stares that carried weight, Shaq received the email. It didn't come from an individual, not even from a personal address. It was from the generic HOA account, admin@sycamorecommunity.org, and the subject line was as sterile as the tone. New amendments to community visual guidelines. Section. The message itself was short, mechanical, detached. As of this week's private HOA board session, it has been decided by majority vote that any lawn decor or structures exceeding 3 feet in height are no longer permitted within community limits. This includes statues, freestanding signage, ornamental lighting, and vertical flag displays. These changes are effective immediately and retroactively apply to existing properties. We ask that all residents comply within 10 business days to avoid further action. No salutation, no explanation, no appeal. Shaq stared at the screen for a moment, then reread it, not because he didn't understand, but because he wanted to fully feel how cowardice was trying to dress up as policy. No one called. No meeting notice. No neighbors knocking with petitions in hand. It wasn't a request. It was a decision quietly made, purposefully targeted, and publicly masked as fairness. He didn't need to ask how the vote went down. He knew. And he also knew this had nothing to do with aesthetic alignment or community values. This was about sending a message without ever having to put your name on it. He closed the laptop. Didn't sigh. Didn't call anyone. Instead, he walked out into the yard. The morning light was just catching the bronze of his father's statue, casting a long shadow across the lawn, a shadow they clearly didn't want in their line of sight anymore. The angels blinked in the low light. The flag stood still vibrant, still unashamed, and that's when something in him clicked. Not in anger, but in calculation. He turned, walked inside, and made his way to the hallway closet, where he kept a few old things from his playing days. Boxes labeled in Sharpie, a life stored in chapters. He pulled out one marked Dad's Stuff, a box that hadn't been opened since he left his last team. Inside were old letters, worn Polaroids, faded newspaper clippings, and a leather-bound journal, heavy with the smell of age and memory. He flipped it open and scanned until he found the quote circled, not once but twice. The loudest protest is done in silence, backed by ownership. Shaq smiled, not a happy smile, but the kind a man wears when he sees the storm before anyone else hears the thunder. Game on. That afternoon he did not begin taking anything down. Instead he called a few people. Not lawyers yet. Those would come later. No, first he contacted his accountant, his old friend from Miami, and a local realtor he'd quietly helped recover from a family tragedy 2 years earlier. He asked questions. Questions about zoning, property availability, and ownership percentages within the HOA. The kind of questions that sound innocent, until you realize who's asking. By sundown, Shaq had a map of the neighborhood printed and spread out across his kitchen island, color-coded by ownership, equity status, and how long each family had lived there. He wasn't plotting revenge. He was mapping pressure points. But the neighborhood didn't know that yet. All they knew was that the man they thought they could quietly erase hadn't flinched. If anything, he got quieter, more deliberate. On day 2, he walked the block, not out of defiance but curiosity. He stopped at homes that looked a little more worn, where lawns weren't as trimmed, where Christmas lights from the previous year still hung crooked over porches. He made mental notes, spoke to no one unless spoken to. One house, in particular, caught his eye, a yellow one with chipped paint and a faded welcome mat that read "Bless this mess." An elderly man, Wallace Crowley, was hunched in a rocker out front, glaring at his newspaper. Shaq slowed, nodded. "Morning." Crowley looked up, squinted. "You that ball player, right?" "Used to be," Shaq replied. "Now I'm just the guy with the angels they want to outlaw." Crowley snorted, laughed once without smiling. "They tried to tell me my weather vane was a hazard. 30 years it's been up there. Never once hit a soul." "You take it down?" Shaq asked. "Hell no," he said. "Told them they can sue me or shoot me." Neither happened. Shaq smiled. Another mental note made. On day 4, a few of the neighbors started murmuring. Not loudly, but enough for it to reach him through the walls of a bakery, through a whisper at the hardware store. People started saying Shaq was making trouble, that he wasn't respecting the rules, that he was being too visible. He hadn't said a word publicly, but in silence they felt threatened, because silence backed by power is far louder than shouting. It wasn't until the 6th day that Holt made an appearance. The HOA president arrived at Shaq's doorstep, wearing his usual pastel sweater and a smile that didn't touch his eyes. He didn't wait for an invitation to speak. "Mr. O'Neill," he began, "I hope you understand these changes weren't personal. The board simply voted in favor of maintaining a uniform aesthetic. You understand, of course, that as communities grow, adjustments are made." Shaq didn't respond right away. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, letting Holt fill the silence with words he thought sounded like leadership. "I have no issue with you personally," Holt continued. "I think you're a fine representative of success. But we have to think of the neighborhood as a whole. Property values, future buyers, the message our presentation sends." Shaq finally spoke. "You know what I hear when you say all that?" Holt hesitated. "What's that?" "I hear a man trying to make exclusions sound like maintenance." Holt's smile faltered for a second. Just a flicker. Then it returned, polished and practiced. "Well, if you feel the decision was unfair, we welcome participation in the next board meeting. We value transparency." Shaq nodded. "That's good to hear." He closed the door before Holt could say another word. That evening, Shaq took nothing down. But he did add something. A new flag, the Pan-African flag, fluttered into place beside the rest, its red, black, and green joining the chorus of stories on his lawn. And this time, he didn't wait for another letter. He just waited for the neighborhood to realize he wasn't going anywhere. Because when they made the vote without telling him, they didn't change the rules. They revealed the game, and Shaq had just stepped off the bench. You could spot Chairman Thaddeus Holt from a block away, not because he tried to be noticed, but because everything about him was curated to give off the air of quiet control. He moved with the stiffness of a man who thought posture was power. His smile was practiced, thin at the edges, and his wardrobe seemed pulled straight from a boutique catalog designed for suburban dominance. Tailored khakis, boat shoes with no socks, and those salmon-colored sweaters draped across his shoulders like he was prepping for a golf fundraiser that didn't exist. He never said anything directly offensive. That wasn't his way. Instead, he specialized in suggestion, the kind that was too slippery to prove, but sharp enough to cut. When Shaq first moved in, Holt came by with a lukewarm pie and a handshake that lingered too long. He said, "Welcome, buddy. It's nice to see a little star power around here. Not neighbor, not friend, just buddy," said in a tone that rang with condescension hidden behind good manners. Holt had a way of talking that turned compliments into warnings. At one HOA meeting, he'd chuckled during small talk and remarked, "Well, now that we've got a real celebrity on the block, let's hope the rest of the neighborhood doesn't go full Hollywood." It got laughs from 2 board members and silence from the rest. Holt thrived on that silence. He knew how to use it, how to feed off it. He never directly challenged Shaq, not in front of others. Instead, he made himself available, present, but distant. Every time Shaq hosted a neighborhood barbecue, it was Holt who just happened to swing by 5 minutes before the music started, making casual notes about street parking and garbage bin placement. One night, after a community movie screening Shaq sponsored for the local school kids, Holt made a point to approach him. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and laughter still echoed in the driveways. Holt leaned in slightly and said, "You know, it's generous of you to do things like this. Though, I'd be careful. Some folks around here prefer a quieter kind of generosity." Shaq looked him in the eye. "You mean the kind that doesn't exist?" Holt's smile didn't waver. "Just saying, not everyone understands big statements. This isn't that kind of street." That was the first time Holt said it out loud. "This isn't that kind of street." And Shaq didn't blink. He just said maybe it should be. That was the shift. Holt didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who refused to play small. As the days passed and Shaq refused to comply with the new lawn decor rule, Holt began turning the screws tighter, not through enforcement, but through performance. He started CCing Shaq on emails about guideline compliance sent to other homeowners, even when they had nothing to do with him. A week later, he dropped off a printed newsletter on Shaq's porch, even though the HOA went fully digital 2 years ago. The headline on page 1 read, "Preserving the Identity of Sycamore Street, Why Standards Matter." There was no mention of Shaq by name, but the timing paired with a full-page spread of the Community Home of the Month, featuring a white column property with beige siding and a single American flag, said plenty. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to, but he started noticing how Holt worked, how he moved. He was always 5 steps ahead, always weaving narratives before people even realized they were part of one. He held private meetings under the guise of informal coffee chats, gathered consensus by isolating individual board members, and used carefully worded language that sounded protective but worked to exclude. Shaq started taking mental inventory of Holt's circle. 3 board members who seemed to orbit him like satellites. One of them, Craig Donnelly, had a nervous habit of tapping his pen against his teeth during meetings, especially when Holt spoke. Another, Meredith Vaughn, wore approval like a mask, laughing at Holt's worst jokes as if they were gospel. The third, Lance Bloom, rarely said anything at all, but nodded frequently, the kind of nod that didn't mean agreement, but submission. Shaq wasn't interested in turning neighbors into enemies. That wasn't his fight. But when Holt tried to take a community and mold it into his image, he wasn't just enforcing order, he was rewriting the definition of belonging. That's when Shaq decided to attend his first HOA board meeting since moving in. He didn't announce it, didn't RSVP. He just walked in 5 minutes before it started, took a seat in the back, and waited. The room was colder than usual, both in temperature and atmosphere. People turned, whispered. Holt, standing at the front like a pastor at the pulpit, gave a tight smile. "Well," he said, "looks like we've got a guest." Shaq nodded once. No smile. "Just curious about how votes happen around here." The meeting went as most HOA meetings do. Dry, bureaucratic, filled with discussions about sprinkler systems, mail theft and repainting fences. But every topic had an undercurrent, a subtext. Holt masterfully steered the conversations toward preservation, protecting values, and community consistency. Then came the final point on the agenda, enforcement follow-up regarding lawn regulation compliance. Holt didn't say Shaq's name. He didn't need to. He clicked a small remote and pulled up a slideshow showing 3 lawns, one with a tall gnome statue, one with a flagpole sporting sports team banners, and Shaq's displayed last and largest. "Here we see 3 examples of non-compliant decor," Holt said. "Of course, some are more prominent, but consistency is key." Shaq raised his hand. "Were the first 2 homes fined?" Holt paused. "Well, those situations are being handled informally. But mine's on the slideshow," Shaq said. "Biggest one. Center stage." Holt didn't blink. We just want to make sure no one feels singled out. Shaq chuckled. Great. So you put my house on a projector in a room full of strangers to keep things fair? Murmurs rippled through the room. Holt's smile tightened. Just a millimeter. We believe in transparency, he said calmly. We're all just trying to maintain what makes Sycamore special. Shaq leaned forward in his seat. Maybe what makes Sycamore special isn't the sameness. Maybe it's the people you keep trying to mute. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that makes walls creak. Holt moved on quickly after that. The meeting ended with a forced round of applause for a new streetlight proposal, and some half-hearted claps. People filed out quickly. As Shaq stood to leave, he noticed something. A board member, Meredith Vaughn, held the door for him. As he passed, she whispered, "He's been doing this for years. People just got tired of fighting." Shaq nodded once. He didn't say anything. But that whisper? It was all he needed to know. Holt wasn't strong because he was respected. He was strong because people had been too exhausted to push back. But Shaq wasn't tired, not even close. By the time he got home, he already had a plan forming. It wasn't about the lawn anymore. It wasn't even about Holt. It was about the difference between being watched and being seen. And soon, the whole neighborhood was going to see exactly who was running the show, and who was about to own the stage. That night, he sat on his porch. The lights glowed softer now, like they knew what was coming. Across the street, Holt's house was dark. The man probably thought silence meant he'd won. But what Holt didn't understand, what he'd never understand, was that quiet doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's just the sound a storm makes right before it builds. The squeak of rubber against concrete came before the sight. Shaq was crouched in the yard, adjusting one of the solar lights near the flag display when he heard the jittery wobble of an unstable tire. He looked up to see a flash of red, a bike weaving slightly, front wheel misaligned, chain dragging loose like a tired snake. The rider was small, helmet askew, legs pumping hard to keep it upright. He stood slowly, eyes tracking her like a basketball play, unfolding. As the girl neared the edge of his driveway, the chain finally gave out. The bike bucked, tilted, and dropped her gently into the grass beside the sidewalk. She didn't cry, just looked at it like a puzzle she hadn't cracked yet. Shaq walked over and knelt beside her. "Tough fall," he said. She looked up, brown hair in 2 long braids, knees scraped, expression open and unafraid. "Chain came off," she said. "Again." "I saw," Shaq replied. "Want some help?" She nodded. Not shy, not scared, just certain that kindness was real, and that he had it. He flipped the bike, steadied the pedals, and guided the chain back into its groove, with 2 fingers. She watched closely, not interrupting, eyes narrowed like she was studying an art form. He tested the pedals, gave the tire a spin. It clicked into place. "There you go," he said. "Back in action." She smiled, full, no filter, the kind of smile you only get before the world teaches you to hide it. "Thanks, Mr. Shaq." He chuckled. "You know my name?" "Everybody does," she said. "You're on the school sign by the gym. And my dad said you used to be famous." "Used to be?" he said, laughing. "I'm hurt." She giggled, climbed back onto her seat, and started pedaling again. As she pushed off, she turned her head. "My name's Millie." "Nice to meet you, Millie." Her little red bike wobbled less this time as she rode back toward the curve in the street. But standing on the corner lawn was her father, Graham Whitmore, arms crossed, wearing the kind of expression that didn't match the weather. Graham didn't wave. He didn't call out to his daughter. He just watched her ride back toward him, and gave Shaq a look. Not loud, not dramatic, but dismissive, distant. Shaq didn't take it personally. He'd seen that look before, in airports, boardrooms, locker rooms, back when people thought being rich meant you were welcome. It never surprised him, but this time, it left a different sting. Because Graham hadn't seen Shaquille O'Neal, the man. He'd seen a moment of joy between a little girl and a neighbor, and instead of being warmed by it, he calculated it. Shaq walked back to his porch, the smile gone. He sat down, elbows resting on his knees, and stared out at the street like it was a chessboard that just changed pieces. That night, the moon hung low, and the breeze carried just a hint of rain to come. Around midnight, Shaq went to retrieve his mail, mostly ads, a bill or two, but tucked between a grocery flyer and a landscaping postcard was something smaller, folded once, handwritten on notebook paper. He opened it under the porch light. "I'm sorry, my daddy said you don't belong here. But I think you're kind. Millie." The handwriting was unmistakably a child's, oversized letters, some uneven spacing, the innocent form of someone who hasn't yet learned to doubt their words. Shaq read it once, then again. He didn't move for a long time. He just sat back down and let the note rest in his palm. It weighed more than paper should. He'd read thousands of letters in his life, from fans, family, strangers. But this one lodged itself somewhere between the ribs, because it said everything he already knew, but in the one voice that hadn't learned how to hide it. The words weren't an attack. They weren't even sad. They were honest. And that honesty was what cut deepest. Her father wasn't just prejudiced. He was passing it down. And Millie, little Millie, on her wobbly red bike, was caught in the middle of an inheritance she didn't ask for. Shaq didn't sleep much that night. He sat on the porch until the sky softened, and with it came clarity. This wasn't just about flags and statutes anymore. It wasn't even about Holt. It was about what they were trying to seed into the next generation. They weren't just defending their past. They were planting it. The next day, Shaq went about his routine like normal. He didn't bring up the note, didn't tell anyone about it. But he made one small change. He added a new sculpture to his lawn. A small bronze of a child on a bicycle, mounted next to the solar-lit angels. Not large, not flashy, but intentional. He had it delivered and installed within hours. By sunset, it was already drawing looks. 2 kids from down the block stopped to admire it. One woman in a tracksuit slowed her walk and took a photo. But most importantly, Millie saw it. She was riding past, this time with both feet confidently on the pedals. She spotted the sculpture and braked so suddenly that her back tire skidded a little. She stared at it, then looked at Shaq, who was watering a line of plants nearby. Their eyes met. He didn't say anything, just smiled and gave her a wink. She beamed, then pedaled away. An hour later, Graham Whitmore stood across the street again, arms crossed, staring at the statue. He didn't say a word, didn't even blink. But his posture spoke volumes. To him, this wasn't art. It was defiance. Shaq didn't flinch. He let Graham stand there, let him feel it. Because some people speak in bylaws and whispers. Others speak in actions and symbols. Shaq knew which side he was on. That night, he framed Millie's note and placed it inside the front door, right above the light switch. A reminder that not all inheritance is chosen, but resistance can be taught too. He started making small changes, quietly. Donated books to the local elementary school. Not about basketball, about culture, about empathy, about history, the real kind. Sponsored a weekend art class at the community center, led by a muralist who painted with kids, asking them to draw what home meant to them. And when some parents complained, when whispers floated about agenda and influence, Shaq didn't answer with statements. He answered with consistency, with kindness,
with presence.
Because while Holt tried to tighten rules and Graham tried to poison legacy, Shaq was doing something bigger. He was investing in the ones who hadn't made up their minds yet. Because racism isn't born, it's taught. But so is kindness. And Shaq had no intention of letting that lesson go untaught. Shaq walked out calmly, thanked the realtor on his way, and nodded to the couple with clipboards. But inside, his blood had gone cold, not from fear but from focus. By the time he reached his car, he'd already decided the next step. He didn't call his friends. He called a lawyer, one who specialized in property law, zoning loopholes, and neighborhood association regulations. A woman named the Delaney Rhodes, sharp, black, no nonsense, and with a reputation for turning local tyrants into headlines. She picked up on the second ring. "This is Delaney." "Shaquille O'Neal," he said. "I've got something for you. It's quiet now, but it's going to get loud real soon." Delaney paused. "Tell me everything." They talked for an hour. By the end of it, she wasn't just on board, she was intrigued. "This ain't just about housing," she said. "This is narrative manipulation. They're scripting out an entire identity." Shaq agreed, and he didn't want a seat at their table. He wanted to buy the table. That night, he took out the neighborhood map again. He'd already marked the homes with older couples, struggling single parents, and quiet owners who had inherited more stress than stability. He now overlaid a new set of markers: homes that were listed, homes that were nearing foreclosure, and properties technically owned by management companies, shell entities likely tied to people like Holt. He started making calls, quiet calls, through quiet channel. The next few weeks moved fast, but under radar. Shaq didn't change his routine. He still waved at kids, still worked in his yard, still hosted the art class at the community center. But behind the scenes, he was acquiring power parcel by parcel, address by address. He bought one home, anonymously, a fixer-upper that needed plumbing work. The owners were more than happy to offload it. He paid in cash, no counteroffers. He helped refinance another couple's mortgage. No public announcement, just a quiet deed agreement that gave him right of first offer if they ever sold. He purchased the empty lot at the end of the street that had once been designated for a park, but had sat unused for years. No one noticed. No one cared. And all the while, Holt remained oblivious, until a random slip at a HOA subcommittee meeting, when Craig Donnelly, the pen-tapping board member, let it spill. "Did you hear about the Vargas place? Sold last week. Full cash buy. Out of town LLC." Holt looked up. "Which LLC?" Craig shrugged. "Something called Sycamore Equity Group." Shaq smiled when he heard that. Because Sycamore Equity Group was him. Created with Delaney's help. Designed to be legally invisible. But in reality, it was a net, slowly tightening around the block. Holt thought he controlled. The next weekend, Holt knocked on Shaq's door. Friendly smile. "Same salmon sweater," Shaq answered. Stone-faced. "Just wanted to check in," Holt said. "Haven't seen you at the last couple meetings." "I've been busy," Shaq replied. Sure, Holt said. "Just wanted to make sure you were still invested in the community." "Oh," Shaq said, stepping forward, voice calm but cool. "I'm more invested than ever." Holt's smile cracked, just for a second. Shaq didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. Because Holt could feel it. Something was shifting, and for the first time he wasn't the one moving the pieces. That night, Shaq added one more flag to his lawn. Not from a country, from a movement. A plain white banner, centered with one word in bold black lettering. Staying. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. And soon, Holt would learn what happens when you try to erase the wrong man from the blueprint. Because this open house hadn't just opened doors. It had unlocked war. It started the way most major shifts do. Subtly. No banners, no announcements, no show of force. Just paperwork, whispered phone calls, and quiet signatures that changed the very bones of Sycamore Street, without raising a single alarm. While the HOA busied itself drafting enforcement letters and celebrating uniform flower beds, Shaq was rewriting the power map of the entire block. The first property was easy, a gray stucco bungalow on the East End, owned by an elderly widow who'd been trying to sell for almost a year. She was tired of waiting, tired of buyers who walked away over cosmetic issues. Her son handled the sale. Shaq's team, operating under the name Sycamore Equity Group, offered full asking, no inspection, cash. It was signed and closed in under 10 days. The second came through a tip from Delaney, a couple facing quiet foreclosure, terrified of going public with their struggles. 2 young kids, mortgage upside down. They didn't want charity. Shaq gave them something else, dignity, a clean buyout, a relocation stipend, and 6 months of rent paid up front somewhere closer to family. He didn't show up with cameras or make a speech. He just handed them freedom, then walked away. The third was more complicated. A landlord-owned property where the tenants had complained for months about mold, broken appliances, and maintenance requests being ignored. The landlord lived in another state and only cared about the rental check. Shaq's team made him an offer he couldn't ignore. When the deal closed, the first thing Shaq did was send in a repair crew. The second, he gave the tenants a long-term lease at their current rate. By the end of the month, Shaq controlled 3 homes, each through a separate LLC, each with no trace back to him, unless someone knew where to look, and no one in the HOA had the vision or resources to even consider looking. But he wasn't done. The real prize was a sliver of land no one paid attention to. A narrow, L-shaped parcel behind the HOA building. Years ago, it was zoned as green space, meant for a small park that never materialized. It had gone up for auction quietly, after falling into tax delinquency. No one on the board noticed. Shaq did. He purchased it through a blind trust, securing the deed to the very land Holt's HOA office sat next to. When Delaney saw the finalized documents, she laughed for a solid minute. "You don't want revenge," she said. "You want jurisdiction." Shaq grinned. "I don't want them gone. I just want them out of the driver's seat." While all this unfolded behind the curtain, Shaq kept playing the public game with flawless performance. He watered his lawn, hosted a chili cookout for 3 streets over. He even started a Sunday morning walking group that picked up litter while talking about basketball, home repairs, and quietly, ownership. He never brought up the HOA. He didn't need to. But every week, another piece of Sycamore changed hands, quietly, legally, and deliberately. Some residents started to feel the shift without understanding why. The tone in board meetings grew tighter. Holt's updates started sounding more like justifications than leadership. His smile grew thinner. He started policing porch light colors and mailbox flags, as if he knew the ground beneath him was beginning to slide. Craig Donnelly, the nervous board member with the pen habit, finally approached Shaq outside the local coffee shop one morning. "You buying houses?" Craig asked, like someone asking if you'd been seen walking with ghosts. Shaq sipped his drink. "I'm investing in the neighborhood." Craig scratched his neck. "Just seems like things are moving fast." "Sometimes," Shaq said, "the best way to protect something is to own it before someone breaks it." Craig didn't argue, just nodded and walked away. At home, Shaq updated the spreadsheet. Delaney had built it for him. A full grid of the neighborhood, color-coded by ownership, mortgage risk, HOA status, and resale probability. They were at 7 homes now, plus the green lot, and 2 upcoming negotiations. He didn't just want to buy the block. He wanted to build a shield around the people they'd never invite to the next HOA vote. The next house was a surprise opportunity. A family of 5, mixed race, had decided to relocate after a series of anonymous complaints wore them down. Noise violations, unapproved fence paint, improper use of their driveway. They were exhausted, ready to leave. Shaq met them personally, not as a buyer, but as a neighbor. He asked about their experience, listened, then made them an offer through Sycamore Equity that ensured they'd leave not burdened but blessed. As they packed up, the youngest son, maybe 8, asked Shaq, "Will it be better after we leave?" Shaq knelt down, looked him in the eyes. "It'll be better because you were here. And one day, you'll come back and see what I mean." That night, Shaq sat on his porch again, watching the street with new eyes. A battlefield disguised as a neighborhood. But now, he held the blueprints. And the numbers didn't lie. 10 homes. 1 lot behind the HOA. Control of just over 40% of the block. At 40%, you don't just have property. You have influence. And influence changes everything. Inside the HOA building, Holt had no idea he was now seated beside people who reported to Shaq before they responded to him. Owners who had once been silent had begun emailing Shaq privately, thanking him, asking for advice, expressing concern about board decisions they didn't feel safe challenging alone. And then came the wild card. A real estate flyer arrived in every mailbox, advertising upcoming new development opportunities on Sycamore. Glossy photos, modern builds, tagline, a fresh future for a classic neighborhood. No contact info, no development company name, just a local P.O. box and a website that didn't exist. Shaq kept the flyer, read it twice. They were testing the waters, floating bait for outside investors, trying to signal that change was already underway. But they were late. Change wasn't coming. It was already here, and it wore size 22 shoes and knew how to read a zoning map. Holt tried to push a new regulation through the HOA, one that limited the number of properties any single entity could own. But it failed on a tied vote. The deciding no. Meredith Vaughn, the board member who once laughed at Holt's every joke. She didn't laugh anymore. She was now living in a home owned by Sycamore Equity Group. And her lease was the reason her mortgage wasn't in foreclosure. Holt knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how deep the vines had grown. Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't make threats. He just stayed steady, present, and deliberate. Because this was no longer about decorations or bylaws. This was about legacy, about control being taken back, not by shouting at meetings, but by acquiring the very ground they walked on. The block didn't need a revolution. It needed a redirection. And Shaq was steering it, with silence, with strategy, and with the kind of power they never saw coming until it was already written in ink. The fluorescent lights in the Maple Lane Community Hall flickered with that anxious buzz reserved for school board meetings, church potlucks, and neighborhood dramas, dressed up as democracy. It was a space meant to feel neutral, welcoming, safe, but tonight, it pulsed with tension so thick you could feel it settle between the chairs and cling to the breath of every resident seated in neat, silent rows. Shaq stepped inside with a presence that didn't ask permission. He didn't need it. He wore a charcoal gray jacket, clean sneakers, and a quiet calm that made some people glance away without knowing why. He didn't look angry. He looked prepared, and that was worse for them. At the front of the room, behind the folding table where the HOA board sat like a tribunal, Chairman Thaddeus Holt sat smug in his salmon sweater. He gave a tight smile, one that hadn't touched his eyes in months, and gestured toward the microphone at the front. 3 minutes, Mr. O'Neill, he said, tapping the agenda sheet as if Shaq needed a reminder of protocol. Shaq stepped forward without a word. No notepad, no speech in hand, just a black leather folder under his arm that seemed too slim to carry much, until he opened it. He placed 3 documents side by side on the table in front of the microphone. Property deeds, lot maps, certified purchase receipts. He didn't announce them. He let the first row see for themselves. It took only a second before whispers began leaking backward through the room like a slow-moving tide. "I'll be brief," Shaq said into the mic, his voice steady but not raised. "I'm here tonight to clarify a few things." Holt leaned back, arms folded like he was watching a slow train he believed would never arrive. "I've heard the concerns," Shaq continued. "I've read the bylaws. I've reviewed the votes, the letters, the meeting notes, the ones I was never invited to, and I've listened to what wasn't said just as much as what was." He looked out over the room. Neighbors. Some nodding, some frozen, some visibly squirming.
"I understand you want consistency, order, community standards. That's fair. Every neighborhood deserves pride."
But when those standards are only enforced on certain homes, when votes are cast in silence to erase stories, to shrink presence, to rewrite culture with landscaping rules, what you're protecting isn't a neighborhood. It's control. And that ends tonight. He turned to Holt. No anger, just precision. "I now own 13 properties on this street. Some through Sycamore Equity. Some through private trusts. All legal, all public record. I also own the deed to the lot, directly behind this building. The one originally zoned for public use. You remember that land, right? The one the HOA's easement crosses every week for trash pickup." Gasps cut through the room like broken glass. Holt's smile didn't fade, but his shoulders tightened. Shaq reached back into the folder and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "These," he said, "are the lease agreements, signed by tenants currently residing in 5 of those 13 homes. They're good people, teachers, nurses, retirees. They've all experienced targeted enforcement from this board. Noise complaints, decorative violations, citations about minor fence repairs. No one else was written up for. And every one of them came to me, quietly, privately, because fear makes people whisper." He paused. Let that sink in.
Not anymore.
Now the murmurs had turned into full conversations. People nudging each other, heads whipping between the documents on the table, and the man holding the mic like a gavel. Holt cleared his throat, sitting forward. "Mr. O'Neill, while we respect your contributions to the community, I'm not sure if ownership entitles you to—" Shaq cut him off. Calm, cold. "You're not sure. But I am." He reached into the folder once more and laid down a printed, notarized resolution. "This is a petition to restructure the HOA board. As of this week, I've obtained majority buy-in from 52% of the voting-capable property owners in Sycamore South. That includes tenants with proxy authority via their lease agreements, which according to bylaw subsection 3.4 qualifies them as voting members." Holt's face went pale. Not visibly to most, but Shaq caught it. That subtle shift, the internal quake that hits a man when he realizes the rules he weaponized have been used against him. "You created the system," Shaq said. "You manipulated it. Silenced people with paper. You made rules to preserve a neighborhood you never really wanted to share." He took a breath, slow and deliberate. "But I listened. I learned. I adapted. And now," he leaned closer to the mic, "I'll be writing the rules." There was no applause, no cheering, just silence. Sharp, stunned, sacred. The kind that only comes when power moves without raising its voice. In the back row, someone exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for months. Holt sat frozen, jaw clenched. Meredith Vaughn shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Craig Donnelly looked like he wanted to disappear inside his clipboard. Lance Bloom, who hadn't spoken in any meeting Shaq had attended, simply closed his eyes. Shaq stepped back from the mic and gently gathered his folder. "I'm not here to replace oppression with more of it," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm here to make sure this neighborhood doesn't erase another family, another story, Another child who learns to whisper before she learns to speak. He looked across the room, and for the first time in weeks, people met his gaze without flinching. I'm not going anywhere. But some of these policies are. With that, he nodded once, turned, and walked out. No mic drop. Just the quiet sound of ownership settling into the room like a crown no one could deny. The moment he stepped outside, the cool night air met him like applause. He didn't smile, didn't strut. He just breathed, deep, long, the kind of breath you take when you've taken back what was always yours. Inside, Holt tried to continue the meeting, tried to salvage what little dignity remained. But the conversation had already shifted. People were whispering, but not in fear anymore. They were questioning. And that's how power crumbles, not with a scream, but with a sentence. I'll be writing the rules. After the meeting on Maple Lane, the neighborhood didn't erupt into revolution. It shifted, quietly, deliberately, the same way it had been bending against Shaq for weeks. It now bent away from Holt. The next morning, the usual HOA email came out, still bearing Holt's signature. But people read it differently. The tone that once passed for authority now rang with desperation. The thinly veiled reminders about compliance and visual harmony felt like echoes from a man shouting down a hallway already empty. He tried to regain control, sent out a second email calling for a special session to address community confusion. Nobody responded. A week later, Holt hired a local attorney to challenge the leasehold voting proxies Shaq had leveraged. The move made local news, if only briefly. But the optics were bad. A white HOA chairman, suing tenants for participating in their own neighborhood's decisions. Delaney, Shaq's attorney, responded with a 3-page public statement, citing HOA bylaws, state property law, and a closing paragraph that read like the final word in a courtroom drama. If a man fears the voices of those he claims to represent, then perhaps his concern is not about fairness, but about being finally fully heard. No one came to Holt's defense. Not even Craig Donnelly, who'd once tried to keep the board afloat with middle-of-the-road diplomacy, could bring himself to back Holt now. In private, he admitted to a few neighbors that things had gotten out of hand. In public, he simply stopped attending meetings altogether. The community mood turned from passive to pointed. Residents who had once mumbled behind closed doors now spoke in clear tones at the community garden or while walking their dogs. Parents began asking real questions about who made the rules, about who enforced them, about why only certain homes had ever been held to standard. It wasn't just adults. The kids had caught on too. One morning, Shaq received a text from a friend at the school district. It included a blurry cell phone video, barely a minute long, but powerful in its clarity. Millie Whitmore, hair in her usual 2 braids, stood at a small podium in her elementary school auditorium. Her 3rd grade class had been asked to give speeches on what makes a good neighbor. She didn't hesitate. Mr. Shaq helps people even when no one's watching. He helped me fix my bike. He waves at everyone. My daddy said he didn't belong here, but I think he makes this place better. And I think people who make things better should get to stay. The room had gone silent. A few gasps. One teacher could be heard whispering, "Wow." Within hours, the clip was online. By that evening, it had been shared by a local news anchor, then a city councilwoman, then a national outlet that had covered Shaq's past philanthropic work. The next morning, Holt tried damage control, released a formal statement through the HOA's website. It was long, defensive, wrapped in bureaucracy. While we appreciate all residents' voices, we must ensure that changes to community leadership reflect long-term policy goals and not momentary sentiment. It didn't land. Not anymore. Because the lie had already been caught in the sunlight. And people saw it for what it was. A man protecting a shrinking throne. Neighbors began requesting to review the HOA's financial records. Meredith Vaughn, once Holt's most loyal supporter, submitted a petition to introduce term limits for board leadership. Her name topped a list of 32 homeowners who wanted Holt gone, not with hostility, but with clarity. The real break came when the HOA's own attorney, previously retained on a modest annual contract, refused to support Holt's legal actions against Sycamore Equity Group. The firm had received too much public pressure, too many calls from clients, too many emails with the subject line, "Are you really going to war with Shaquille O'Neal?" They withdrew. That was the beginning of the end. Holt kept showing up, week after week, wearing those pastel sweaters like armor. But fewer people listened. Board meetings turned into awkward gatherings of 5 or 6 attendees, where Holt talked to empty chairs, and scowled at the silence that used to be obedience. Eventually, even he seemed to get tired of the echo. It wasn't a formal resignation. There was no farewell email, no tearful speech. One Thursday, he just didn't show up. No one asked where he was. A week later, the HOA website was updated. Holt's name was gone from the list of board members. Craig's name was back. So was Meredith's. But this time, she wasn't laughing at anyone's jokes. A new chairman was elected within a month. A soft-spoken librarian named Tom Lanning, who wore wrinkled button-downs and didn't smile unless he meant it. His first action, repeal Section 4.2a, the Decor regulation Holt had weaponized.
His second?
A neighborhood picnic, posted on the green lot behind the HOA office, the very land Shaq now owned, and had quietly made public use again. No speeches, no signs, just food, music, and kids running under strings of lights. Millie was there. So were the Monroes. So was Lucille, sitting under a large umbrella with a plate of ribs and a sun hat that said blessed and unbothered. Holt wasn't there. He'd sold his home 2 weeks earlier, packed up with no announcement, no wave goodbye, no final meeting. His property had sat on the market longer than usual. No one offered above list. The house closed quietly. A young couple with 2 kids moved in. They didn't ask about the previous owner. Shaq didn't celebrate Holt's departure. He didn't need to, because real justice doesn't always look like a courtroom or a takedown. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it's just a man sitting on his own porch, drinking iced tea, watching kids ride by on bikes their parents once thought would never be safe here. Sometimes justice is the absence of fear, the silence where control used to live, and the space finally made for something better. 1 year later, Sycamore Street didn't just look different, it felt different. The air carried a stillness, not the kind bred from fear or rules, but one born of restoration, as if the street itself had exhaled, finally allowed to stretch out without the tight grip of silent judgment. Where Holt's restrictions once drew invisible lines, now stood art, color, and laughter. Lawns weren't identical anymore. They were expressive. Some had murals on their fences, others tiny garden libraries for kids. A few kept things traditional, still neat and simple. But now, no one whispered about who fit and who didn't, because everyone belonged. At the very center of the block, in the small circular park that had once been an unused lot, now stood the sculpture, not in the corner, not trimmed behind a bush or hidden by regulation. It stood in the open, bold and unapologetic, a bronze silhouette of Shaq's father, arms outstretched in mid-laugh, head tilted slightly upward like he was catching a joke thrown down from the sky. At night, it glowed, lit by a ring of low solar-powered lights that made it shimmer like something holy. Around it, the ground was lined with stones, each one engraved with words donated by community members. Words like strength, joy, welcome, and legacy. But it was the plaque at the base that said everything. For those who stood tall when others wanted them small. Shaq had resisted making the moment about himself, but the neighborhood had insisted. So the dedication happened quietly. No reporters, no banners, just folding chairs, potluck dishes, and voices cracking over gratitude too long held back. And now this place, this block once steeped in coded language and controlled silence, had become something else entirely. It had become alive. Shaq sat on his porch most mornings now, a large mug of tea warming his hands, rocking slowly beside Lucille, who had moved in 2 months prior. After her health scare in early spring, they decided she didn't need to be alone anymore, and Shaq didn't need a reason to bring his mama home. They made a ritual of it, watching the sunrise, critiquing joggers' form, trading observations like sportscasters calling a quiet game. "You see how Miss Tanisha plants those roses crooked on purpose?" Lucille said one morning. "That's her being rebellious. God bless her." Shaq chuckled. "She said symmetry reminds her of math class. And she's still mad about algebra." Lucille sipped her tea. "Good. Makes the street less boring." The porch had become a symbol too. Neighbors waved when they passed. Not out of habit, but because they meant it now. And when they stopped to chat, they didn't lower their voices. They asked questions, shared stories, invited Shaq to their kids' baseball game, or offered up slices of banana bread still warm from the oven. Even Graham Whitmore, once the coldest shoulder on the block, had thawed. After Holt's quiet departure, and Millie's video going viral, the man had slowly started showing up differently. He still didn't say much, but he showed it in actions. He let Millie paint their mailbox in pastels. He waved first on Tuesdays, and one day, when Shaq's mail got misdelivered to his door, Graham brought it over himself. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain, but he said thank you, and that was enough. Millie, of course, became something of a legend, not just for her words, but for her spirit. She zipped down the street now with 2 friends riding behind her, their bikes newly repainted with bright streamers and baskets lined with pinwheels. They called themselves the Porch Patrol, and their job, according to Millie, was making sure nobody feels weird being themselves. One day she asked Shaq, "Can we plant a peace tree in the park? Only if we let every kid put their name on it." He answered, and they did. Now a young maple stood near the sculpture, surrounded by little painted stones, each one bearing a child's name in glitter, chalk, or marker. It wasn't just a tree, it was a promise. The HOA still existed, but now in a form that matched its name. Tom Lanning, the new chair, operated with transparency. Board meetings were open, streamed online. Residents got real votes, real voice. Delaney even helped draft the new bylaws, stripping out the clauses that had once been used to divide and exclude. Under the new system, community projects flourished. A mural was painted on the east end wall facing the intersection. A blend of faces, shapes, and symbols that represented what the block had become. It read, "We grew here." People came from other neighborhoods to see it, not because it was famous, but because it was real. At night, Shaq would walk through the park sometimes, headphones in, playing old soul songs. He didn't need to patrol, didn't need to monitor. He just walked. And every time he passed the sculpture, he'd give his father a nod. "Still got your back," he'd say under his breath. Lucille would tell anyone who asked that she was finally sleeping better than she had in years. "No more worry dreams," she said. "The house knows peace now. The porch hums different." And it did. Because peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of truth. And on this block, the truth had been fought for. Not with fists, not with fury, but with faith, focus, and a fierce kind of love that refused to shrink. Shaq never gave a grand speech about it. That wasn't his way. But one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the lawn, he leaned back in his chair beside his mother, tea in one hand, eyes on the sculpture. The kids were racing past, laughter echoing. Flags waved gently in the breeze. The angels still glowed. And for the first time since moving in, he exhaled with a whisper that wasn't tired or heavy. It was "Now this feels like home." Lucille smiled, eyes closed. "Told you. They just needed to feel who really lived here." Shaq nodded, quiet. Because now, the block wasn't just owned. It was held, by story, by memory, by power that didn't need to raise its voice to change everything. If this story made you pause, feel, or look at your neighborhood a little differently, you're exactly who it was meant for. Because change doesn't start in courtrooms, it starts on porches. Keep showing up, keep standing tall, and when they hand you silence, build something that speaks louder.